For generations, people were told that some nations simply weren't ready. Not ready for large projects, not ready for modern infrastructure, not ready to build for themselves. And in Africa, that excuse has been repeated so often that many stopped questioning it. But right now, something very different is happening in Burkina Faso. Picture this red Sahel dust hanging in the air, bulldozers moving through open land, men and women working through the heat day and night. No grand ceremony, no foreign executives, no ribbon cutting for cameras, just work, real work. In just over a month, more than 230 kilometers of land have already been cleared for what will become the first modern highway in the country's history, a 332-kilometer road connecting the capital to the nation's economic heart. This project officially began on December 15, 2025, under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré. And by late January 2026, progress had already surpassed what many thought possible. Over 70% of the first phase completed. Not promised, not planned. Completed. What makes this moment remarkable is not just the speed, it's the method. Local communities are involved, traditional authorities are consulted, environmental teams, engineers, and administrators work side by side. People don't feel displaced, they feel included. For many, this road is not just concrete and asphalt. It is dignity. It is proof. For decades, critics argued that Africa lacked the capacity to deliver large-scale development without outside control. Yet here we are watching a nation move forward using its own labor, its own coordination, and its own political will. No lectures, no permission slips. So the question becomes unavoidable. What happens when leadership aligns with the will of the people? And just as importantly, what does this say about Africa's true potential when results matter more than approval? As you watch this story unfold, I invite you to think beyond the headlines. Think about work ethic, community, ownership, and the quiet power of getting things done. If you believe development should be judged by results on the ground, not by who gives approval, please share this video. Subscribe if you believe Africa's future deserves to be told through action, not assumption. To understand why this project has captured so much attention, we first need to be clear about what is actually being built and why it matters. For the first time in its history, Burkina Faso is constructing a modern national highway linking its political capital, Ouagadougou, to its economic heart, Bobo Dioulasso. The distance between these two cities is 332 kilometers, and until now, that stretch has never been connected by a true highway built to modern standards. For decades, transport along this corridor relied on narrow, deteriorating roads, slow, unsafe, and costly for farmers, traders, and families. That reality began to change on December 15, 2025, when the transitional government under Ibrahim Traoré officially launched the project. What followed surprised many observers. By January 27, 2026, just over a month later, officials on the ground confirmed that more than 230 kilometers of the highway's right-of-way had already been cleared. In some reports, the figure reaches 232 kilometers, meaning that nearly 70% of the first construction phase was completed in record time. Trees were uprooted, roots removed, vegetation cleared. The land was fully prepared for the next stage: earthworks and road foundations. This is not a symbolic milestone. Clearing the right-of-way is one of the most labor-intensive and time-consuming phases of any major highway project. It requires heavy machinery, constant coordination, and uninterrupted work schedules. In this case, bulldozers operated day and night, 7 days a week, supported by maintenance crews, technical supervisors, and environmental teams working in parallel. What stands out is not just the pace, but the organization. According to engineers involved in the project, multiple teams are operating in what they describe as symbiosis. Technical units handle machinery and logistics. Environmental services manage land impact and vegetation removal. Administrative authorities coordinate access and permissions across districts. And crucially, local communities are directly involved, helping clear fallen trees and facilitate access to work zones. Rather than resistance or disruption, cooperation has become a defining feature of the project. Traditional leaders and village authorities along the route were consulted early. Their involvement reduced friction and allowed work to proceed without the delays that often plague infrastructure projects in rural areas. For residents, the highway is not viewed as an external imposition, but as a long-awaited national undertaking. That distinction matters. For many Burkinabe citizens, this road represents more than transportation. It promises lower food prices by reducing transport costs. It means faster access to markets for farmers. It improves mobility between regions that were once effectively isolated during rainy seasons. In practical terms, it shortens travel time, reduces vehicle wear, and strengthens national integration. The project also challenges a long-standing narrative often repeated about African development that large-scale infrastructure can only succeed with foreign oversight, external financing, or international contractors leading the way. In this case, the emphasis has been on domestic coordination, national labor, and clear political direction. No one involved claims the work is easy. Environmental challenges are real. Terrain varies. Weather conditions can slow progress. But those difficulties are treated as expected obstacles, not excuses. As one official noted, any highway leaves a footprint, and managing that footprint responsibly is part of the job, not a reason to stop. At its core, this first phase is about preparation, laying the groundwork literally and figuratively. Before asphalt is poured and bridges rise, a nation is proving something more fundamental: that it can plan, mobilize, and execute at scale. And that is why this project has drawn such attention. Not because a road is being built, but because of how it is being built, who is building it, and what it signals about Burkina Faso's capacity to move forward on its own terms. Every major story has a turning point, a moment when facts stop being just facts and begin to challenge assumptions. In this case, the climax does not come from a speech, a ceremony, or a headline. It comes from speed. By late January 2026, it became impossible to ignore what was unfolding on the ground. In barely 6 weeks, more than 230 kilometers of land had been cleared. Bulldozers were still moving. Crews were still rotating through night shifts. Maintenance teams kept machines running without pause. The work did not slow down once the cameras arrived. It continued as if no one was watching. That is when the tone of the conversation began to change. For years, a familiar argument has followed African politics that military leaders have no place in government, that development must wait for proper civilian systems, and that stability requires external supervision. Those talking points are rarely debated when results are absent. But when results appear clearly, measurably, and quickly, the questions become harder to dismiss. In this project, the contrast was stark. Previous governments operating under civilian frameworks and international partnerships had discussed infrastructure for decades. Plans were announced, studies were commissioned, timelines were extended, yet nothing comparable materialized on this scale or at this pace. Now, under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, a long-promised national highway was no longer theoretical, it was visible. Measurable. Moving forward kilometer by kilometer, this is where the emotional peak of the story takes shape. Supporters began asking a simple but uncomfortable question. If this could be done so quickly now, why was it never done before? Not as an attack, but as a reckoning. Engineers and project officials openly stated that Africa has the labor, the skills, and the equipment to deliver large projects. What was missing, they argued, was not capacity, but will. Critics responded predictably. Comment sections filled with familiar warnings. The military, some said, should return to the front lines and leave governance to civilians. Others questioned sustainability. A few dismissed the progress as temporary or symbolic. But the road kept advancing. And that persistence reshaped the debate. The argument was no longer theoretical, it was visual. Every cleared kilometer stood as a response in itself. Work schedules 24 hours a day, 7 days a week became part of the message. Not shouted, not dramatized, simply demonstrated. The reaction on the ground was equally telling. Instead of protests or resistance, communities along the route showed growing enthusiasm. Villagers assisted with clearing fallen trees. Traditional authorities helped coordinate access. People spoke openly about feeling included, not displaced. For many, this was the first time a national project felt like something done with them rather than to them. That sense of ownership amplified the emotional impact. This was no longer just a government initiative, it became what many described as a project of the people, a long-awaited undertaking that carried national pride alongside practical benefit. Internationally, reactions were more muted but not absent. The absence of foreign lenders, consultants, and branding logos was itself a statement. No IMF press conference, no World Bank unveiling, no foreign spokesperson explaining the project's significance. And yet progress continued. That silence spoke volumes. For observers in the United States, especially older viewers familiar with America's own highway building era, the parallels are striking. In the mid-20th century, highways reshaped the U.S. economy, not because they were perfect, but because they were built with urgency, coordination, and belief in national purpose. The Burkina Faso project evokes a similar spirit. Results first, debate later. The climax of this story, then, is not a confrontation, it is a comparison between talk and action, between delay and execution, between narratives imposed from outside and realities created on the ground. And once that comparison is made, it becomes difficult to return to old assumptions. Because when machines keep moving, when communities stay engaged, and when progress remains visible week after week, the question is no longer whether Africa can deliver. The question becomes whether the world is prepared to reassess what it thought it knew. As the highway project moves forward, its consequences are already extending far beyond bulldozers and cleared land. Long before the first layer of asphalt is laid, the road is reshaping daily life, political expectations, and the relationship between citizens and the state in Burkina Faso. At the civilian level, the most immediate impact is psychological. For many families along the Ouagadougou to Bobo corridor, this is the first time a national project of such scale has arrived with visible momentum and stayed. People who had grown accustomed to announcements without follow-through are now watching progress unfold in real time. That shift matters. When citizens see work advancing consistently, trust begins to replace skepticism. Practically, the implications are just as significant. Once completed, the highway is expected to reduce transportation costs for farmers and traders moving goods between the country's administrative center and its commercial hub. Perishable goods will travel faster. Vehicle maintenance costs will fall. Seasonal isolation caused by heavy rains will diminish. These are not abstract benefits. They affect food prices, household income, and regional stability. But perhaps the most profound civilian consequence is participation. Unlike many past infrastructure efforts, this project has integrated local communities from the outset. Residents have assisted in clearing vegetation. Traditional authorities have coordinated access and communication. Environmental concerns have been addressed through cooperation rather than confrontation. The result is a sense of shared ownership. The road is not perceived as government property alone, it is seen as a collective investment. That sense of inclusion carries political weight. In recent decades, public frustration across parts of Africa has often centered on distance between leaders and citizens, between promises and outcomes, between plans and lived reality. This highway narrows that distance. It sets a new benchmark for what people expect from leadership, not ideology, but delivery. Politically, the project has sharpened debates about governance itself. Critics of the current leadership continue to argue that military involvement in politics is inherently problematic. Supporters respond not with theory, but with results. The question increasingly asked within Burkina Faso is no longer who governs, but how governance is exercised, and whether it produces tangible improvements in people's lives. This reframing has consequences for future political legitimacy. When citizens begin to measure leadership by performance rather than form traditional political arguments, lose some of their power. Infrastructure becomes evidence. Progress becomes political capital, and expectations rise. Leaders who follow will be judged against this standard regardless of their background. Internationally, the project also alters Burkina Faso's posture. By advancing a major national highway without visible reliance on external financial institutions or foreign contractors, the country signals a shift towards self-directed development. This does not mean isolation or rejection of cooperation, but it does suggest a rebalancing of influence. Partnerships are no longer framed as necessities born of incapacity, but as choices. For audiences in the United States, this dynamic may feel familiar. American history includes periods when large public works projects transformed not only landscapes, but civic confidence. The New Deal, the interstate highway system, and post-war Reconstruction reshaped how Americans understood government's role. In Burkina Faso, a similar recalibration may be underway on a different scale, in a different context, but driven by comparable principles of purpose and mobilization. Of course, challenges remain. A cleared road is not a completed highway. Financing later phases, maintaining momentum, and ensuring long-term quality will test the system. Success raises expectations, and expectations bring scrutiny. But that too is a consequence. A society that expects results is no longer passive. A political system judged by outcomes must continue to deliver, and a project that begins as infrastructure can evolve into something far more consequential, a redefinition of the social contract between state and citizen. In that sense, this highway is not only connecting two cities, it is connecting action to accountability and reshaping how both are understood in modern Burkina Faso. From a global perspective, what is happening in Burkina Faso is striking, not only for what it includes, but for what it deliberately leaves out. There are no international press conferences announcing donor commitments, no global financial institutions standing at podiums to claim credit, no foreign contractors dominating the narrative, and yet progress continues steadily, visibly, and without apology. That absence is not accidental. It reflects a quiet shift in how development is being approached and communicated. For American audiences, especially those who lived through periods when national projects were judged by outcomes rather than branding, this approach feels both unfamiliar and strangely familiar at the same time. In the United States, major infrastructure breakthroughs, whether during the New Deal era or the expansion of the interstate highway system, were not primarily defined by international approval. They were defined by speed coordination and public belief that the work served a national purpose. Burkina Faso's highway project echoes that logic even as it unfolds in a very different geopolitical environment. Internationally, reactions have been cautious. Western governments and institutions have largely responded with silence rather than endorsement or criticism. This restraint speaks volumes. The project does not fit neatly into established narratives, neither as a failure to be corrected nor as a model easily claimed. It operates outside familiar frameworks of development aid, conditional financing, and external supervision. That ambiguity is precisely what makes it significant. By advancing a major national infrastructure project under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso is testing a simple but powerful idea that development legitimacy can come from delivery rather than validation. The highway does not ask for permission. It presents results. For critics in the West, this raises uncomfortable questions. If a country long described as aid-dependent can mobilize labor, coordinate institutions, and advance large-scale infrastructure on its own terms, what does that imply about past assumptions? Were limitations truly technical, or were they political? For supporters, particularly across Africa and the global African diaspora, the project has become symbolic. It represents a break from narratives of incapacity. It suggests that sovereignty is not merely a political slogan, but a practical discipline, one that requires planning, endurance, and accountability. From a U.S. policy perspective, this moment invites reflection rather than reaction. The project does not threaten American interests. It does not reject cooperation. It does not declare opposition. Instead, it quietly recenters agency. For older Americans who value self-reliance, community participation, and results-driven leadership, the parallels are difficult to ignore. At the same time, the global implications are broader. If more countries pursue development through internal mobilization rather than external dependency, traditional influence channels may weaken. Financial leverage becomes less decisive. Narratives of control give way to narratives of competence. In that environment, respect is earned through partnership, not prescription. This does not mean the road ahead is guaranteed. Sustainability, maintenance, and long-term economic integration will determine the project's ultimate success. But the signal has already been sent. Africa's development conversation is evolving, and that evolution challenges the world to listen differently. Because when progress is visible, when communities are engaged, and when results speak for themselves, the question is no longer whether Africa deserves a seat at the table. The question becomes whether the table itself is ready to change. As this highway continues to take shape, one truth is already clear. What is unfolding in Burkina Faso goes far beyond transportation. Roads can be measured in kilometers, but moments like this are measured in consequences. The most important question now is not how fast the land was cleared or how many machines are working through the night. The deeper question is what happens after success. Because history shows us something sobering: progress attracts pressure. When a country demonstrates that it can organize itself, mobilize its people, and deliver results without waiting for approval, it inevitably challenges established expectations. Not everyone welcomes that shift. Skepticism follows. Doubt grows louder. Standards suddenly change. Achievements are scrutinized in ways that earlier failures never were. This is not unique to Africa. Americans have seen it before. When new paths disrupt old systems, resistance often comes disguised as concern. For Burkina Faso, sustaining momentum will matter more than celebrating milestones. A cleared road must become a finished highway. A finished highway must be maintained. Economic benefits must reach ordinary people, not just appear in reports. And leadership, particularly under Ibrahim Traoré, will ultimately be judged not by intent, but by endurance. That is the warning embedded in this moment. Yet there is also a broader horizon opening up. This project suggests a different development language, one that prioritizes participation over prescription, ownership over dependency, and results over recognition. It does not reject cooperation with the world. It simply reframes it. Partnerships become choices, not conditions. Respect becomes mutual, not hierarchical. For older American viewers, this story resonates on a familiar frequency. It speaks to values many recognize work before words, responsibility over rhetoric, and the belief that dignity comes from building something with your own hands. It recalls an era when progress was something you could see, touch, and drive on, not something endlessly debated. The question now extends beyond Burkina Faso. If this approach holds, could it influence other nations across the Sahel? Across Africa, could it encourage leaders to focus less on pleasing external audiences and more on delivering for their own people? And if so, how should the world respond? Not with fear, but with recalibrated respect, because whether one agrees with every political choice or not, one fact remains difficult to ignore. A nation long described as incapable is quietly proving otherwise, and that deserves attention. So we leave you with a final question, one worth reflecting on carefully. When development begins to speak louder than assumptions, are we prepared to listen? If you believe that progress should be measured by action, not ideology, please share this video. If you value stories that challenge old narratives with real-world evidence, subscribe. And if you think Africa's future should be discussed with honesty, respect, and seriousness, join the conversation in the comments. The road is not finished, but the direction is becoming impossible to ignore.